The Euromaidan was a series of protests in Ukraine against the current government, with President Viktor Yanukovych for pulling Ukraine closer to Russia instead of the European Union. What time is it? That's right, it's time for another revolution! Again, times 10. And how did the government that they're revolting against get into power? That's right, a revolution! Revolutions are just human nature at this point. The French had 3 of them. Anyway, I digress. Starting in November 2013, there was a revolution of dignity, which saw violent clashes between protesters and police, which left 108 protesters dead and 13 police. This revolution saw the removal of Viktor Yanukovych as president on the 23rd of February, as well as a weakened Ukraine. A weakness Russia exploited. On the 20th of February 2014, Russia invaded Crimea, starting the Russo-Ukrainian War that has now gone on for 10 years. It was a quick initial conflict, which the Russians won easily. On the 17th of March, Crimea declared its independence, and on the 18th, it was annexed by Russia with a referendum that saw an overwhelming Russian turnout. The West sees it as illegal, and don't see Crimea as Russia. Thanks to both the revolution and invasion, pro-Russian forces protested in the east and south of Ukraine, and this saw the separatist regions of Donetsk and Luhansk seize government buildings and declare independence, starting the war in the Donbass. After declaring independence, the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics soon came into conflict with Ukraine. On the 12th of April 2014, the war in the Donbass started, and fighting raged on throughout 2014 and 2015. Most of the casualties and fighting were at the start of the war. Although they didn't end the war, many ceasefire agreements were attempted, notably the Minsk I and Minsk II protocols. There were 29 failed ceasefires. Although the conflict was most deadly at the start, it was still very dangerous later on, as in 2017 a Ukrainian soldier would die every 3 days. Due to the lack of border changes, the war was seen as a frozen conflict. The conflict did eventually end though, as Russia decided to commit to a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, subsuming the war into the Greater Invasion. In 2021, there was a build-up of Russian troops on the border with Ukraine. On the 21st of February 2022, Russia sent a group into the separatist regions of Ukraine as peacekeeping forces. 3 days later, on the 24th, after an announcement by Putin, 190,000 Russian troops entered Ukraine on 3 fronts: from the south through Crimea, from the east through mainland Russia, and from the north through Belarus. The Russian forces blitzed through Ukraine, getting extremely close to Kyiv. Everyone thought Ukraine would fall quickly, but they held out against the Russian forces and started a counteroffensive, kicking Russia out of the north and stabilizing the front. The Russian advance slowed for many months, and the front line barely moved. During this conflict, many Ukrainians were forced to flee from their now non-existent homes. 6 million Ukrainian people have fled the country and are now refugees. Another 8 million have been displaced throughout the country. Ironically, Russia has the most Ukrainian refugees, with 2.9 million. That's nearly half of all refugees. This is then followed by Poland, 1.4 million, Germany, 1 million, and the Czech Republic, 0.4 million. September 2022 is one of the biggest months for this conflict, probably the biggest since the start of the war. Early in September, Ukraine did a counteroffensive in Kharkiv, pushing the Russians out of the region. Due to the offensive being a surprise, the Russian forces were outnumbered 8-1, allowing Ukraine to blitz through and retake the entire Kharkiv region. Due to the amount of territory taken and how quick it took to take, many jokes came on the internet saying how Ukraine took more land in 4 days than Russia did in 5 months. They were referencing Russia's slow progress up to this point. On the 21st of September, Putin announced a partial mobilization of the Russian reserves. About 300,000 reserve troops were mobilized and went to the front line. Also in September, Putin announced that referendums will be set up in the occupied regions on annexation to join Russia. On the 30th of September, Putin announced the annexation of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. These referendums are seen as illegal and illegitimate by most international countries, except North Korea, which is the only country that accepts the annexation. On the 29th of August 2022, Ukraine started a counteroffensive in Kherson. This was a hard-fought battle, and it didn't take the city until the 11th of November the same year. The Russians still control part of the oblast, just not the city, as Ukrainian forces stop at the Dnieper River. Since then, the front line has been stable, with only small gains like a few towns or villages. There were many trenches within Ukraine, and many have described the war as a World War I style stalemate, with now it simply being a war of attrition and seeing who will collapse first. Unlike the previous year, there wasn't much at the start of 2023 when it came to big events. Of course, things were happening like both sides taking towns and villages, but when it came to major events, the war was quiet for the first half of the year. But then, in May, there was an invasion into Russia. This invasion was not carried out by Ukrainians, but Russians, specifically the Freedom of Russia Legion. When the war started, many people from different countries came to aid Ukraine and fight for them. Some of these soldiers were Russian and set up the Freedom of Russia Legion. Belgorod is a Russian oblast on the border with Ukraine. This place has been bombed many times and has a large amount of Russian civilian casualties. This is the area that was invaded. The Freedom of Russia Legion, as well as the Russian Volunteer Corps, which is a far-right anti-Putin group led by Denis Kapustin, a famous neo-Nazi, on the 22nd to the 23rd of May 2023, made an incursion into Belgorod, stating that they intended to create an international zone. Other Russian, Belarusian, Polish, and Chechen militant groups aided the attacks. A second two-week incursion took place from the 1st to the 15th of June, which led to Russia upgrading its defences for Belgorod. Since the 17th of June 2023, there have been small sporadic incursions into Belgorod. On the 4th of June 2023, Ukraine began the anticipated counteroffensive, and it didn't go well. It lasted many months until late 2023, until it was deemed a failure. Ukraine only recaptured 14 villages in the Donbass. It wasn't worth it as Ukraine lost over 90,000 killed or wounded personnel, almost 600 tanks, and around 1,900 armoured vehicles during the counteroffensive. June 2023 was significant, just like how September was for 2022. What time is it? That's right, it's time for a rebellion. Not a revolution this time. As all of this was happening, on the 23rd of June, the Wagner Rebellion started, with many believing that Russia was about to fall into a second civil war. This saw Wagner march on Moscow, Putin set up defences and prepare for a fight, but after only a day, the rebellion was over, and they stopped marching to Moscow as an agreement was made. Wagner leader Yevgeny Prigozhin supported the invasion of Ukraine, but felt that Russian Minister of Defense Sergei Shoigu and Chief of General Staff Valery Gerasimov was to blame for Russia's shortcomings. Exactly 2 months after the rebellion, Yevgeny Prigozhin was killed in a plane crash along with other senior Wagner leaders. As Ukraine's counteroffensive came to a close in late 2023, and as a new conflict took centre stage, the war once again fizzled down to a near stalemate status. This proves the war is attrition-based, and whoever can break the front line first will see massive gains. This war will likely continue for years to come until one side collapses. Unlike in the previous year, stuff started happening early on as Georgia accused Ukraine of trying to expand the war. A truck filled with explosives was heading from Ukraine to Russia through Georgia and other third-party countries. French President Macron refuses to rule out NATO troops in Ukraine. British troops are on the ground in Ukraine, helping in small numbers. This was confirmed by Rishi Sunak. There are also rumours of British troops in Ukraine since the start in 2022, however these are unconfirmed. David Cameron said that Britain is willing to loan Ukraine all Russian frozen assets in the central bank. This offer is contingent on Russia paying reparations to Ukraine after the war ends. Lots of things are happening, and the war isn't over yet. 2024 will be an important year for Ukraine as Western support is wavering and the ability to launch counteroffensives is becoming harder. Many countries are not passing bills to help Ukraine like the US Republicans, and some are in recessions like the UK. The number of casualties in the war is estimated to be as high as 500,000. This would include not just deaths but wounded, POWs, etc. Now, the exact number is hard to get during the war, but the number of deaths is easily in the hundreds of thousands. This year is a big one and will decide many things like who may dominate the battlefield from 2025 onwards. The West wants results, and Ukraine needs supplies to provide those results, but Ukraine can't get those supplies without results. If an offensive is successful, then the war would tip in Ukraine's favour with more Western support. If an offensive is like 2023, then the tip is in Russia's favour. Only time will tell.